Hello. So I'm in California right now with my girlfriend and we just went to a bookstore and I absolutely could not resist buying a copy of Thirst. I knew this was coming out and it was part of why I felt like reading some sapphic vampire literature. We also went to see Nosferatu last night, and so that really put me in the mood for some more vampire lit. And I read the first chapter in the store and I was just like already addicted. And just like, look at this beautiful book, like the pink and red, the light pink and red spine. I'm just totally obsessed. And then when you open up the jacket, it's all pink and red and black. Like, I'm just so in love with this physical book. With echoes of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Thirst plays with the boundaries of the Gothic genre while exploring female agency, a breakout genre-blurring novel from an exciting new voice of Latin America's feminist Gothic. Like, please. And it's translated. That kind of put me in the mood to reread Frankenstein also, and Dracula. So yes, I'm very, very, very excited about this, and I will get back to you when I have an update. Hello, I am back in New York, and I have finished part 1 of Thirst. Oh my god, you guys, I am completely obsessed with this book. It is so good. It's so hot and so well written. Like, this is true literary fiction with all of the bisexual, vampire, erotic writing that you could ever desire. I'm really, really, really excited to keep reading. I can't wait to see how the first chapter, like that little prologue chapter, is going to intersect with the narrative that part 1 has focused on, which I imagine it will. I'm hoping for some lesbian bloodlust, perhaps some eternal love, some undying devotion. Okay, some things that I wanted to chat about. I find the origin story of the vampire protagonist very interesting. It's very much a story that I understand as like girls being made evil by a predatory man, and then her experience of persecution very much mirrors the historical witch hunts. And then the legends became news. They began to believe in our existence. And while we struggled to understand what happened, I lost my sisters. That reminds me a lot of like trans rights and like the recognition of trans existence, but then also the persecution of trans people. So I just thought that was like an interesting queer allegory that is like available in a reading of persecution of demons in society. The diction, like the vocabulary, is so strong, and I'm really like reminded that words are a spell that cast a mood. And this author is so skillful, and the translator as well are poetic geniuses, and I'm like, this is writing. Like, this is so inspiring in terms of quality fiction that just makes me crave blood. I feel like the Enlightenment is like a big theme here, and like the tension between so-called civilization and wilderness. Yeah, the colonization of the so-called New World. It's set in Argentina, and I feel like colonialism and white supremacy are subtle themes in this text. Like, non-white people are certainly not invisible in this historical writing. Like, a lot of the story is set during the yellow fever, so of course there's also big plague themes. Yeah, I was seeing like echoes of COVID. But yeah, like one of her lovers slash victims is like this man who is rich from having defended the land from indigenous people. And so when I'm like rooting for him to die, you know? Oh yes, and I do certainly see the Frankenstein comparison in that the monster of the text is made into a marginalized other. The writing is just so stunning. The themes, the motifs of the moon and candles, I'm just so in love. The vocabulary of girlhood and femininity, and the sex scenes are so devouringly good. Oh yeah, and she's very much like anti-Christian, I would say. Here's a passage. The church that in its narrow vision of the world assumed the right to declare that I and all those like me were creatures of the devil, departures from God's plan, when in fact our existence was proof that the plan of which they spoke was an invention of man. and a fairly uninspired one at that. Get his ass. I do think it pairs very well with Nosferatu. Like, I had begun to resemble my creator, and the bitterness which had grown in me over centuries could only be soothed by more crimes. Like, that's deep and speaks to trauma. And yeah, the aesthetics and longing and romance are just so perfect for Valentine's Day season. I'm so excited for my girlfriend to read this. I just love this book so much, and I cannot wait to sink my fangs in and finish it. Hello. So it is my girlfriend Alessandra's day off from her job as a florist, and we are going to go to No Filter, which is my favorite gothic cafe, and read some more vampire literature. There's also this part in Thirst where the vampire protagonist, mourning the loss of her lover, who was herself a kind of Frankenstein's monster, goes underground for over a century. And I feel like that's just really like, if you liked my year of rest and relaxation, you'll love the 100+ years I spent beneath the earth mourning my vampire girlfriend. Fake vampire countess who was like known as a vampire who like stole a young maiden's blood to bathe it. Hello, it is the next day and I have finished Thirst. I stayed up late finishing it, like past midnight, because I was totally addicted and could not stop. And here are the things that I wanted to say. So the first is about the ending. And this is a spoiler, so if you don't want to hear it, you can skip to this timestamp. But I was expecting an open ending, and it's not an ambiguous ending. It's a very specific, explicit resolution to all the building tension, in which our protagonist, Alma, does become a vampire. And I was kind of shocked and disturbed. And I think it's because Alma is a mother. And what's really interesting about this book is that it explores in depth Alma's experience of her mother dying. And with the help of her vampire lover, Alma assists her mother in suicide. And she's very ill at the end of her life, in a clear act of love to help her die with dignity. And reading that, I'm like, makes 100% sense. It feels like the morally right thing to have happened. But then I read Alma's subsequent choice to become a vampire as a kind of suicide born of depression due to the grief of her mother's death, which like also makes sense emotionally, but it was disturbing because she is a middle-aged mother and has a young son. And this had me thinking about like maiden, mother, crone life phases and vampirism, where I feel like I've actually only ever seen vampires who are young women, like in their teens and 20s, represented in media. And so it's very interesting to me that it evoked that kind of emotional sensation of like, oh, that's wrong, like she had this responsibility to her son. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting that that was disturbing to me. And then other things that I wanted to say were, oh, there is sort of Carmilla reference in the moment where she sees the vampire beside her bed. And I really felt strong like feminist themes here of like regarding the mother's death. I wrote here a note, the deadliness of women's silence when the paralysis that started with her tongue was progressing through the body. I also thought it was feminist when like the mother attempts suicide and it's described as an act of rage and determination. I really appreciated that actually. And in general, I found the juxtaposition of the mother's death with this like erotic vampiric story to be very effective. On the one hand, in terms of helping me to become enchanted and complicate the process of suspension of disbelief, because in part one, I'm like totally on board, vampires are real. This is a world in which it's not a question that vampires exist. But then in part two, I'm so involved in the mundane dailiness of reality that involves like going to the dentist and all of this contemporary scientific medical vocabulary that I'm like, wait, like are vampires real? Is this a hallucination? Is this like a delusion that she's having in her grief? So I loved that. And like this fear of death, no one was willing to utter or even hear the word death, which my mother had spoken so forcefully with her body. And then going back to the themes of sort of colonialism and the forceful imposition of so-called civilization over nature, basically. I feel like that's really explored in this fear of death, and also kind of like the futility of medical science in terms of stopping death. And like there's this intense juxtaposition of what I wrote here is like sex and death, romance and realism, pussy and rot, that I feel like really makes this literary fiction and not just like erotica, because there is a lot of like gross, abject, grotesque stuff in here that kind of intersperses the like sexy fantasy vampire romance sections, and that makes for a more complicated, textured, gritty, realist, embodied read. I will say also on that, I personally am very squeamish, and I was like grossed out at times. I could handle it, but yeah, just maybe note that if you're squeamish as well, be prepared. And like I love this moment where she's like going to the crypt and she has her like iPhone flashlight, and we get this like, again, juxtaposition of like the ultra contemporary with the gothic historical. I watched NB Reed's YouTube video about vampire literature as well, where they read this one, and they observed that it's much more of like a bisexual vampire text than a lesbian one, and I strongly agree. We actually don't get evidence that Alma, the human woman, is queer. Or actually we do. We get evidence that she's bisexual and she's masturbating and she has this like bisexual fantasy. The vampire is definitely bisexual. I'd say tending lesbian in that like she sort of uses men for sex more so, and has like this long romantic infatuation with a girl, a woman, young woman. And then we suppose with Alma as well, like that's sort of the implication at the end that like they are together for eternity, I imagine romantically, but in the text itself, like they don't have sex. She drinks her blood in an alley, which is very like sexually coded. It's very sexual, but I mean, what is sex? The vampire is described as very cat-like. I love like her feline teeth. She put her feline teeth on the side of my neck. She has claws as well. That's also kind of a reference to Carmilla, I think, in that there's like a connection between the like feminine vampire and a cat. And I thought it was interesting that Alma gets her period and masturbates and describes each of those events as feeling like the first time before she becomes a vampire. Also, like, the dates remind me of Dracula in the format of the text. Oh yes, I was very interested in the river, in that like it's changed over the years and there's only so much left, that the river symbolized hope to the vampire, and then the river is described as something else out there somewhere, the meager promise of knowing that hope. Interesting, Ophelia core. There's totally themes of like insanity in here, which is interesting. Connection between insanity, vampirism, hysteria. Yeah, I feel like the rising tension, especially towards the end of the book, is very effective at enspelling the reader. At least I was extremely hooked and could not put it down, because I was wondering like, okay, like what is gonna happen with this vampire? Like, is she real? Are they gonna have a relationship? Is Alma gonna become a vampire? The crimes, and like, are these gonna be addressed or solved? Is Alma gonna be implicated in that criminal process? What's gonna happen regarding the mother's death? What's gonna happen regarding the son? Like, there were all of these stakes that were vaguely being developed that I was like, oh my God, like what is gonna happen? How is the author gonna tie all this together? And it was quite emotionally satisfying, though also kind of like excruciating or ecstatic at the end, being like, like, oh my God, what the fuck? So yeah, I loved this book so much. This is a true 5-star read in my opinion. Very complicated, very complex, leaves me with a lot of sort of not unanswered questions in terms of the plot, but just complicated emotions regarding the story, which I think is a sign of like a deep read that is moving and skillful in its telling. I highly, highly, highly recommend this book if you're craving excellent literary fiction about lesbian / bisexual vampires. When I woke up this morning, I immediately started reading Carmilla. I have read this twice before, once on my own 2 years ago, and then once last year in my MFA course on the vampire's metaphor in fiction. And so having that prior experience, I'm finding it to be like a very easy read and very enjoyable. Oh, also I just love this edition so much. Isn't that so gorgeous? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes. Yeah, and like I'm reminded that it was initially published in like the newspaper for the people to read. Like it's not meant to be inaccessible, and I find it quite readable. Oh yeah, that reminds me. Thirst, I think, is also very satisfying in length. Like it's quite short. It's only 240 pages. And then Carmilla is like even shorter. And in both, like the text is pretty big on the page and it's like kind of spaced out. Like it goes fast, which is pleasurable in my opinion. Yes, I guess like a few things that I noted this time. I love that Carmilla literally references Ophelia, the passage from Hamlet. In truth, I know not why I'm so sad. It wearies me. You say it wearies you, but how I got it came by it. I just love that. I'm loving the gothic nature descriptions. I'm also interested in this like girls as butterflies thing. Kind of reminds me of Teresa of Avila. And I guess this time like I'm paying attention to Laura's Christianity, the fact that she's described as having blonde hair and blue eyes, and just like the text's position in regard to Christianity, especially towards the end of chapter 4, when Laura's father says, "We are in God's hands. Nothing can happen without his permission, and all will end well for those who love him. He is our faithful creator. He has made us all and will take care of us." Then Carmilla is saying, creator, nature. This disease is natural nature. All things proceed from nature, don't they? All things in the heaven, in the earth, and under the earth act and live as nature ordains. I think so. And then they immediately evoke the doctor. The doctor said he would come here today, said my father after a silence. I want to know what he thinks about it and what he thinks we'd better do, which is actually kind of reminding me of that theme of like the futility of medical science over death, and I guess the larger theme of a patriarchal heavenly father god versus feminine nature in this conceptualization of like good versus evil, like the dominance of Christianity over nature, which one prevails in this story, in these stories. That's interesting to me. I'm excited to keep reading Carmilla, and I will get back to you when I have another update. Hello. So I wanted to come on and update you because I have also now read part 1 of Woman Eating by Claire Kohda. and I'm obsessed and I cannot stop reading it. Also, this one is like even shorter than Thirst. It's only 230 pages, and it's another contemporary lit fic novel about an ostensibly queer vampire. This one came out in 2022. It's been on my radar, but I hadn't read it yet. I think honestly because I was kind of repulsed by the title, like on a certain level, which is certainly pertinent to the content, but also like it is like the exact right time because it's exactly what I need right now. This one is also kind of like my year of rest and relaxation. She's like in this like depressive dark studio being crazy, and I love it. It's so comforting. Okay, so these are my thoughts. Okay, so our protagonist is kind of racial minority coded, and I think biracial. She is by species, like her mom is a vampire and her dad is a human. She's raised by her vampire mom. Also, her vampire mom is currently sick and in a retirement home, which is kind of similar to Thirst in that aspect. This story is exploring eating disorders, eating disorder content, which obviously can be triggering. Though I will say, I actually came to this book last night because I was feeling triggered about food. And I was like, actually, maybe this will have solace. And like, yes, it really does for me. Like, she deeply gets it. There's a line in here that says, if you lose control in your life, you can find control in your food. And I'm like, yes, that is just so resonant this week, especially of January 2025. I'm like, you know what? I just want to be a vampire in my dark studio and eat blood. So yes, she's like at the grocery store reading nutritional value information and like admiring like other people's like orthorexic ideal foods. She's like Googling what I eat in a day content for inspiration or escapism. And actually, I'm also kind of obsessed in her sort of musings on the ethics of consumption. There's this line, there always seems to be something that suffers or dies as a result of any form of food consumption. And once all suffering is whittled out of a human's diet, they can't survive themselves. I just love that observation. It reminds me a lot of Chris Kraus writing in Aliens and Anorexia about Simone Weil ostensibly starving herself to death because she couldn't handle injustice in the world. I have so much to say on this topic. But anyway, the vampire in the story actually eats blood. And specifically, pig's blood, which I feel like evokes Carrie. And also her relationship with her mom is reminiscent of Carrie as well. Her mom is like a self-hating vampire and very Christian coded. There's this really powerful line about Christian shame. The narrator, our protagonist, says, I was somehow more my mother and less my father, more demon and less human, evil and sinful before I was even born. I feel like that just really speaks to that deep Christian guilt, Eve wound, original shame. And they don't pray to God, they pray to pigs whose blood they drink because, according to her mom, God would not bless them because they're demons. Also, the reason that her mom has them drink pig's blood is because she views pigs as like lowly and impure creatures and believes that as vampires that's what they deserve. But there's this beautiful passage about pigs and how they're actually such good and gentle creatures who are known to like wash their fruit in the creek, and it's just that they're forced by humans into terrible conditions, which I find so moving and I appreciate so much and makes me so grateful that I'm vegan. I also love that she watches Buffy, and I want to know like what episodes are you watching? I want to know. I love it. Also, so far this has not been gay, so I am waiting for it to get gay. In the meantime, there's this guy Ben that I really don't care about, and I feel like I'm not supposed to care about him. Like, I want her to eat him. So we will see how that goes. I'm gonna go read more right now, and I cannot wait to see what happens and get back to you with my next update. Hello, I'm back, and I have read part 2 of Woman Eating, and here are my thoughts. So one is I thought more about like the pig symbolism, and I realized also, obviously, of course, pigs in our culture are a symbol of like greed and gluttony. So that's interesting. And in this story, vampires, like pigs, are forced into terrible conditions. And that is significant with the racial metaphor of vampire that is being explored here. So that's very interesting. Also, the story gets into the Malaysian myth of the vampire, as well as British colonization as part of like the background and setting of this story, which is interesting. And by the way, it is set in London. This is a British book. I think I forgot to say that last time. Okay, another thing I was thinking is the protagonist living in her studio and painting is reminding me of the book Sirens and Muses, and I do think that this would be a good read for fans of Sirens and Muses who want something with vampires that is maybe also a little bit like Sirens and Muses is a college story, and this is a post-college story. And speaking of, I really personally relate to the life phase that this narrator character is in. Like, she is kind of struggling post-college, and she's like, how do I get from this shitty internship where I'm at to where I want to be in like my creative career? And I feel that, like, I'm 25 and I finished my MFA, and it's like, how do I get from here to where I want to be? Just like, you know, the difference between school exams and real life trials. She's feeling small and undervalued. I'm like, I personally relate. And so it's like fun to experience that catharsis like through a vampire. In this section, there is a new element that's introduced, which is that she is experiencing workplace harassment, which is like very creepy and I would say triggering at like her art gallery internship. But we know she's a vampire, so she has power over her enemies. So that's interesting. And I read the designer's note at the back of this book, which I love, explaining that her choice of this Caravaggio painting for the cover was about the antagonist. So I think that's this Gideon character that we've been introduced to. And also I loved the designer's note that these cracks are like a vampire bite. Okay. Still not gay. So what's up with that? She did experience actually some street harassment where someone called her a dyke. So I'm like, okay, is that some foreshadowing? I hope so. And there was this actress talking about madness and the moon, and I was like, yes to that. But the way part 2 ends, I'm annoyed. So eager to see how this all plays out and wraps up in part 3, and I will talk to you again once I am there. Okay, hello, hi. So I'm back with another update. I have finished Woman Eating. I found the ending very satisfying, except not sapphic. Literally not gay at all. I was just completely mistaken and misguided with that expectation, so alas. And I did still really like and appreciate this book, especially for its eating disorder and religious trauma content. So in this section, the character starts watching what I eat in a day videos and posts on Instagram and YouTube, and gets into some eating disorder recovery videos. And there was a quote that I really liked where she is watching an eating disorder recovery video and she observes, I wonder if perhaps there's a demon in the woman trying to starve the human so it can take over the skin and skeleton and organs completely. And that really resonated with me because I once had a profound experience when I was younger and more actively fighting the demon of my disordered eating, looking in the mirror at my mom's house, and I saw like a monster living inside of me, like a disgusting monster that was my eating disorder. And I knew that like it lived on my starvation. So like for me to starve myself was to feed the monster, and the only way to kill the monster was to feed myself. And like it doesn't go away, like it still lives within me, but so long as I don't feed it, like so long as I feed myself, it doesn't kill me. And so I liked that. I also liked how her relationship to drinking blood really mirrors like sexuality, and I feel like she has this sort of what we could read as like Christian shame about sex that she expresses in her relationship to drinking blood, which I just found really interesting. I also, of course, loved the Buffy content. She gets a little more specific in part 3. She's having this fantasy of just staying on the sofa for centuries watching Buffy, and I'm just like, same. That is my fantasy as well. Okay, and she discusses the Buffy and Angel arc of season 2. And Allie, my girlfriend, and I recently rewatched season 2, and I feel, just by the way, that Buffy should have killed Angel when he had a soul, and he should have not come back from hell. He should have suffered in hell eternally, because what kind of 200-year-old man fucks a 16-year-old girl, frankly? That said, I also really agree with the protagonist's description of Riley when she describes him as an annoying new non-vampire soldier boyfriend. That about sums it up. Okay. I also started The Gilda Stories by Jewel Gomez, and I had read one of these stories in the vampire literature class that I took in my MFA, but I wanted to read the whole book, so I'm doing it now. This is a lesbian feminist story of a Black woman vampire in America from 1850 to 2050. And it was published in 1991. So I've read the first 3 stories at this point, which is Louisiana 1850, Yerba Buena 1890, which is what is now known as San Francisco, and Rosebud, Missouri 1921. So it's been really cool so far, like experiencing American history through this character's perspective. It starts with her escaping from slavery in Mississippi and going from the home of her mother to finding a queer found family. At first, she's just called the Girl, and she gets taken in by a lesbian couple who run a brothel, which is sort of like a home for lost girls, which I guess like provides them with a safe house and a means of earning some money in this time period. So this lesbian couple that takes her in is a white woman named Gilda and a Lakota woman named Bird. And then in the first story, Gilda dies by suicide, and the girl takes on the name Gilda. So she is Gilda for the rest of the stories. And that is all just so interesting and good. And I just love that, you know, this was written like decades ago and really holds up as like a shining example of literary skill and beauty and like complex representation. Like, I just love it so much. I would say it did take me a little bit to get into it first, but once I read like the first 15 pages, I had gotten used to the writing style, and I'm now really into it and loving it. It is like a deep read. Like, it starts out in this sort of dream blur, and there's some amazing poetic lines. Like, on the first page of the story, it says, "In sleep, she clutched the hand of her mother, which turned into the warm wooden handle of the knife she had stolen when she ran away." Like, that's just so beautiful. So far, there's been lesbian lust and lesbian longing, but not yet lesbian love. So I'm still holding out for that. There's also a lavender motif, which I love. Like, there's repeated references to lavender and earth, lavender water, a lavender wool 2-piece dress with black piping. This is like in the late 19th century when Gilda is designing her own sort of queer fashion. I just love it. Also, the style of vampire that she is very interesting. Like, there is a big emphasis on reciprocity. So like, she hunts for blood to feed herself, but always gives something in return to the people that she takes from and heals them and plants, and this often takes the form of like planting a dream inside their mind. And this is like how she was taught by her vampire mothers and how it's done in her vampire family, which I just love. And that said, there are some like satisfying moments of like cathartic violence. Like, she turns the violence of racists back against this guy who's harassing her. And actually in the foreword, Gomez says that she was motivated by an experience of street harassment to write this book, and also like healing from sexual violence. Like, she gives a girl who's been assaulted a dream of something to live for, and this experience also heals Gilda and inspires her to live, and I just love that. So yes, I will talk to you again soon. Okay, hello, hi. I am back with my final update for this vlog, and I have finished 3 books, so let's discuss. First is The Gilda Stories. And actually, I wanted to say that this pairs really well with Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis, which I happened to be reading at the same time. The reason is that this one goes through the history of Black women in America, and it's nonfiction. This one is the life of a Black woman vampire in America from slavery to the future. And this one starts in slavery and ends in projections for the future. So it's perfect. And in the Gilda stories, one of the characters at one point describes themselves, the vampires, as living histories, which is perfect. And Angela Davis herself is mentioned in the 1970s. Someone has a poster of her on their wall. And this was published in 1981, whereas this was published in 1991. So that's just really perfect. And I highly recommend this perfect pairing. In terms of the story, we finally get some lesbian love, yay. And so I'm talking about Effie. And I love that after literally one night, like they have sex one time, and then Effie is like, I think that you should move to my house in New Hampshire. At that point, Gilda has lived in New York for 10 years. And then there's a time jump. 40 years later, they're living together in New Hampshire as partners. I just love that. Something that I kind of struggled with is that they have this sort of vampire sex family, and there are these sex scenes that blur the relationship terms, like that very explicitly bring in, this is a mother relationship, this is a brother relationship, this is a sister relationship into the sex scene, which I find really uncomfortable. But like from a metaphorical perspective, I understand, but it can be a little challenging, in my opinion. I found it interesting that in the section that's set in 2020, some of the elements of this like imagined future at the time of writing are very accurate to the reality of the year 2020. Like they have video calling, and 2020 really was the year of the video call. The economy had taken a sharp downturn. The health of the cities had failed, and it's a situation of environmental destruction. I'm like, unfortunately, that is all very accurate. I find it hilarious that although the United States still exist in this imagined future, they refer to what had once been called Canada. So that's awesome. The Canadian nation state has been dissolved. And then in 2050, she is literally living in a cave. There are vampire hunters sent by the rich who want to steal their power and kill them. So that's interesting. And I found it very interesting also that within that, like there had been this call for people to change the way that they're living, sacrifice their comforts, whereas it seems to me that like what's needed even more so than that from everyday people is to fight the billionaire class who's hoarding resources from 99% of the population and get them to relinquish their destructive forces, because they are like the true vampires. And like we do kind of see that playing out here. And it says, still the government refused any attempt to reverse the train of destruction they had put into motion. Accurate. So they would plan a future much different from the one envisioned by the government. Yes, let's do it. I also found it interesting that there was criticism here in 1991 of the way that disposability culture was impacting environmental destruction, and commentary about empty luxury high-rise penthouses in the ruins of New York City in this apocalyptic time. I also loved the imagery of river suicide and silver moon bows. So that is the Gilda stories. I would say that this is absolutely worth reading. There's an afterword by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which really puts that in perspective even more for me. She writes, what kind of bravery did it take to write a Black lesbian vampire novel in a time period when the rise of the religious right was impacting publication norms and restrictive public funding by equating lesbian and gay art with pornography? That sounds extremely familiar in regard to what's currently happening with the government's attack on trans people's right to exist. And so that speaks to me of the importance of the archive, that there have been times like this before. There have been artists and activists resisting, and we can and we will get through. Alexis Pauline Gumbs also referenced an Audre Lorde poem that can be read as a Black vampire poem. So that is all that I had to say about the Gilda stories. I really do recommend that you pick this up and read it. I think it can be a little bit challenging because the sentence and paragraph structure can be a little bit unconventional, but you can get used to it and it's really worth it. The next book that I finished is Carmilla, and I don't have that much to say. I love the kiss. This is my favorite page. I love it so much. I also love the specter in the shape of a cat who is Carmilla haunting Laura at night. I just love that. I was also really into the imagery of a coffin full of blood, of Carmilla's body burned and her ashes scattered into the river. That really reminded me of a witch, of Ophelia. I was interested in the concept of vampirism being caused by suicide, and I loved the references to coffee and chocolate. I also took note of the male characters in this story, whose function is to preserve and impose order, like patriarchal order. So we have the father, we have the doctor, the good doctor, the clergyman, the good priest, the general, the woodman, and like all of these social roles, in my understanding, are about like man's power over woman, man's power over nature, like God, like the masculine God's power over earth. And they say the Inquisition will be held according to law, which of course also reminds me a lot of the witch trials and the way that patriarchy seeks to impose control and force over women and the earth. And the horrible enemy of the vampire is defined in contrast to God. So that's very interesting. And I also found myself thinking about the integration of ancient superstitious folktales into Christian myth, kind of in the same way that there are pagan symbols that are integrated into Christian mythology and practice, because like the author is even referring to the vampire as an ancient pre-Christian idea, but then it's being taken up here in this Catholic context. So that's very interesting. I was also intrigued by the somewhat ambiguous ending, like is Carmilla still haunting Laura? Will they be together in the end, in eternity? I love it. This was like my third time reading this book and I really enjoyed every time. I find it to be a very fast and easy read. So if you are interested in a short classic about lesbian vampires or sapphic vampires or girl love vampires, I highly recommend that you pick this up. The final book that I read is An Education in Malice. This was also a reread for me. I listened to the audiobook this time while puzzling, which was excellent. And I'd say that I really did enjoy the audiobook. The narrator does the Southern and Austrian accents of the characters. So having already read the physical book, I was able to really enjoy that. And her voice is very soothing. I first read this when I was on the train from Boston back to New York when I went to Salem this past October, which was perfect because it's set in Massachusetts. That first time that I'd read it, I was utterly enthralled, internally screaming, could not put it down, could not even stop to annotate the beautiful passages, like even though I would have wanted to. There's some really beautiful floral language in here that I really enjoy. And this time I tabbed as I listened, which was very enjoyable. I had a bit of a drama because I ran out of this first color that I was tabbing the things I loved with, which I found kind of matched the face of the flower on the cover. But then I solved my problem by switching to purple, which matches the stem of the flowers on this cover. And then I had this like perfect yellowy color that matches these details for like the Christian elements of the book that I was keeping track of, and I had some gray for things that I was interested in but weren't necessarily like beautiful imagery that I loved. So that was really fun. Okay, so what is this book? This is a Carmilla adaptation that is dark academia set in 1968. It is so lesbian and so hot and so fun and so addictive, and I love it so much. It's set in this school that's like the forgotten other sister of the Seven Sisters women's colleges in the context of this poetry writing workshop. I love Laura's writing obsession. I love the multitude of literary references, and here I find them all so apt and so delicious. I love the fashions, like they're wearing sweaters and mini skirts. I love how sapphic it is, and also the scenes of girlhood and feminine friendship. Like there's this scene of like a party in the bell tower, which is really sweet, and like a friendship trip to San Francisco, which I also find really like endearing. There's a vampire party, which is like so sexy, and also a Dante party at the university, which when I first read it brought back a memory of my having been to a Dante party in university. When I went to liberal arts college, we had that. Like the same thing as in this book, like each floor of the dorm, a different part of Dante's Inferno. So like Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. But I was like, wait, like did that actually happen? So I had to text my dear friend Emily, shout out, and ask them like, did that really happen? And they were like, yes, believe it or not, it actually did. So that was so fun to read about and remember. Anyway, so this is a academic rivals to lovers tale of Laura Sheridan. You might recognize Sheridan from Sheridan Le Fanu, author of Carmilla, and Carmilla Karnstein, who have this good girl, bad girl, Christian vampire dynamic going on, and it is really fun. They have this professor, de la Fontaine, who is a predator and a literal vampire. But the thing is, she is really hot, and like I am so against the like older man, teenage girl vampire trope. But honestly, when it's a beautiful literary scholar and a girl in her 20s, I'm like, okay. There are some parallels to the Gilda stories, interestingly enough. I picked this one up when I was at the Massachusetts 1955 section of the Gilda stories. And so it was kind of perfect because, like Gilda, who is born in Mississippi and makes her way to Massachusetts among other states, Laura, our protagonist, is from Mississippi and goes to this college in Massachusetts. But of course, Laura is coming from a very different perspective than Gilda because Laura is white and she is very Christian. She's Episcopalian. She wants to be a priest. So I was very interested in the role of Christianity in this story. So Laura is Christian, like Laura and Carmilla, who is Christian, and that is like in contrast to Carmilla. And I actually noticed a cute parallel where here she's like, I had never seen Carmilla on her knees, and then here she's like, I wanted to see her on her knees. I'm like, yes. But the thing that's interesting to me here is that Laura like does not lose her religion through her encounter with vampirism or lesbianism. And I find that the book does kind of end on a Christian note where Laura says that, you know, her practice of Christianity is not hurting anybody. And then it ends on this line about sunlight. And S.T. Gibson is admittedly influenced by Anne Rice and Donna Tartt, who are Catholic. So this book is sort of situated in that tradition, which I think is interesting and complicates maybe my more black and white worldview that there's like witches and vampires versus Christian patriarchy, and maybe speaks to the idea that like you can be queer and Christian. Personally, like I am skeptical of that because in my experience, patriarchal religion, though it might be inclusive to an extent, is like fundamentally and structurally anti-queer. All of that said, I was also really interested in lesbian sexuality and shame in the context of Christianity. Laura describes feeling untamed by Carmilla. At first, she doesn't feel shame about her interest in erotic literature despite her Christianity, but then when she actually does have sex with Carmilla later, she does have a big wave of shame, which I found realistic. Interestingly though, like after their first kiss, they meet this figure, Isis, who is Madame de La Fontaine's ex. And by the way, are Madame de La Fontaine and Isis parallels to the other two women in The Carriage? Interesting. But yeah, like what does Isis represent? Is she like primal desire? At one point, Laura uses the term base animal nature. There's references to the temptation of Satan. Carmilla becomes a vampire. She's made one. Isis makes Carmilla a vampire. So what does this symbolize? I wrote in my reading journal when I first read this, I'm left wondering, especially in the context of Christianity, what does Ms. D's bestial ex, Isis, whom she has to kill, symbolize? Is it unrestrained sexuality, a la original sin? I'm really interested in that. So if you've read this, or if you do read this, or if you wrote this, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that. And yeah, like with Isis, there's also parallels to Carmilla, like this idea of a lost tomb that they have to kill the vampire with decapitation. Other parallels that I noticed were that the beautiful setting here parallels the Gothic nature descriptions in Carmilla, and this one also has a somewhat ambiguous ending, which I found kind of frustrating, honestly, because like the plot is like quite structured, and so I was expecting like a neat ending. So I don't know, I was a little bit like unsatisfied, but I think like we can guess what is gonna happen with fair confidence. So that is An Education in Malice, and that is my video on lesbian vampire literature. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more, and let me know if you read any of these books, what you thought about them. If your Valentine offered you the vampire's kiss of eternal life, would you take it? Let me know in the comments down below, and I will see you in my next video. Thank you so much for watching.